Lockdown regulations ease and some sense of normality returns, South African consumers are being warned not to fall into pre-lockdown spending habits. How has consumer spending changed as a result of COVID-19, and how can consumers adapt? For this, I'm joined by Chief Operations Officer of the Debtbusters, Benay Sager. Benay, good evening and thank you for your time tonight. How can we avoid pre-lockdown spending habits as we get back into, I suppose, the normal things, even though many are predicting that the normal thing is only going to be really evident in 2022?
Thank you, Thabo, for having me on this important topic. It is true. I think for the first few months of the lockdown, we really couldn't spend money on anything. And as your former guest also said, we were sitting pretty, especially in April and May. And I think as things started to ease up and the economy have opened, our opportunities for spending our hard-earned cash has also come back. So, you asked a very important question. How can one avoid the same habits? I think what lockdown has probably taught us is that we probably don't need to spend as much as we thought we did previous to lockdown. If you can get by for 3 months without spending money on things that we would normally spend money on and still survive, for those of us who are fortunate enough to get an income, that probably tells us that there was some excess spending in our budget that we could do without. And, we'd like to focus our consumers on whatever those excess spending items might have been. And I think for each consumer, that's going to be different. There's different ways that consumers spend on entertainment or travel. While those are important things, I think consumers have probably learned that there are different ways to spend their money and stretch their money further.
You're going to have a combination of things going forward: reduced hours, pay cuts. You're going to have reduced earning potential. Plus, you're going to have an economy that is going to be contracting, others saying double digits. Those who are a little bit more conservative saying maybe by 7%. Is the low inflation going to help?
I think the low inflation definitely helps, and also what we've seen help with the consumers, especially those that have been speaking to Debtbusters over the last 3 months since the beginning of April, is, as you would recall, the repo rate is at all-time low. And what that means for a lot of consumers, on top of the lower inflation, is that many of them are saving a lot of money. In fact, based on our Debtbusters research, we know that many consumers who have a bond, and if they have a vehicle finance, they're spending somewhere between 800 to 1,200 rand per month on the payments, purely because of the repo rate going down to 3.75%. And if you couple this with, let's call it low inflation, which is traditionally be around 6%, but we are now looking at it to be around 3%, that's quite significant. Now, the one important thing to keep in mind is, what really drives inflation isn't that 3% number, but really what our consumers in South Africa feel that they're spending money on. So if petrol goes up by 25%, it really doesn't matter if inflation is at 3%, because what the consumers on the ground level feel is very different. So I think it will be quite important to watch not just the reported inflation figure, but also the one that is driven by things like increase in fuel prices and medical aid and other things. That will be quite important to watch.
Now, you mentioned the very low repo rate. Is that reason to go borrow?
My answer to this question, Thabo, is always it depends. So I think consumers who already have a bond or vehicle finance, those are generally the two types of loans that are tied to the repo rate. They are already seeing the benefits because they would have a variable rate and they are paying, as we said, between 800 to 1,200 rand less per month. If you are a, let's say, young and aspiring consumer who has saved some money and who is thinking about your first vehicle purchase or your first house purchase, and you can afford it, now would be a great time to go in the market for it. So repo rates, as we said, is historically low, and if you get in at this point in the marketplace, you're going to reap the benefits, at least for the next few years. And the repo rate, we don't anticipate to go up significantly over the next few years. Yeah. And again, it depends if you have the money.
Well, I mean, lenders will be a little bit tighter now because maybe they might not want to take the risk. Or if they do take the risk, you might be paying a little bit more for that money.
Yeah, we have already seen the tightening of the lending, I think over the last year and a half, in fact, going into this lockdown. I think it's always important to remind the consumers that our economy was already suffering going into the lockdown. We had already the double downgrades, and the third one had come in the day after we went into the lockdown. And essentially, because of those things, I think lending criteria was already tightened going back as far as probably 18 months ago. So I think consumers were already feeling that it's a bit difficult for them to borrow, and that's what we have been seeing at Debtbusters. And I think going forward, it's going to be even more difficult because the lending criteria is tighter, and the number of consumers that the banks and lenders would want to lend to is probably far less today. It's a much smaller number than it was, let's say, 6 months ago.
Well, we are asking a question: what will you prioritize, additional sources of income or paying off debt? A lot of the people reacting on social media tonight saying paying off debt. What is the rule of thumb when paying off debt as far as long-term and short-term debt is concerned?
Thabo, I'm delighted to hear, and I've seen the comments, I'm delighted to hear so many people are thinking that's exactly the right way to think about it. I think our advice normally is start with paying off anything. You know, it doesn't matter even if it's a 500 Rand account, pay it off and you feel like you won something. It feels like a victory, and you can raise your hands and high five your friends and your family. And as you go along, you know, tackle the bigger and bigger debts. So if you are considering paying off debt, start with the smallest amount so that you can feel like you're making progress. If you if that's too confusing or it's not possible for you, you can also look at where you're paying the highest interest rate and highest amount that you're paying on a monthly basis. That could be another strategy. I think it all depends on how much money you will have available to you to pay on a monthly basis. But generally, the first place to start would be to pay off the smallest debt, and then you can tackle the next one.
As you tackle the next one, what is the quickest way to eliminate or even minimize that debt?
So I think it depends on the nature of the debt that you have. I mean, if you leave aside now, let's say mortgage type of debts, it's generally for 20 years. It's quite difficult for any of us to eliminate that debt in the short term. But now if you think about some of the unsecured debt, which is the category we would put in, let's say, personal loans and credit cards and things of store cards in that nature, I think it does come down to how much you can afford in terms of monthly payments. So the options available to you is if you have, let's say, money owed to one creditor, and let's say you multi-bank, you're banking with one entity. So let's say you have multiple accounts with the same bank. It's probably a good idea for you to approach that entity and say, I want to pay down my debt. What are the options available to me? If you have, if you are multi-bank, if you've got multiple accounts with multiple lenders, and you're kind of struggling in terms of making your obligations every month and meeting them, we always advise that you speak to someone who's qualified. In our case, it would be someone working at Debtbusters. Consumers can actually get in touch and get some advice on what are the options available to them. I think the answer to your question will depend very much on the balance between how much you earn and how much you can pay back towards your debt. And that's quite a delicate balance. And we normally tell consumers, if you are spending more than 40% of your net income, meaning your take home, if you're spending more than 40% of that to pay back your debt on a monthly basis, you probably should seek help from a professional. And in this case, I would say a debt counselor to really help you rearrange your debt. If you are below that threshold, you're probably making ends meet, but you do have to watch that you're not overextending yourself to go above that threshold.
Now, let's talk about the buzzword now. If you ask any expert, they tell you save more, spend less. How do I do that practically? How do I reflect that in practical terms?
It's very difficult at this point in time. And I think we have to be realistic as consumers about how much we can save and in what fashion. I think these days, my advice generally to our consumers, especially those we speak to at Debtbusters, is try to sign up with some of the programs that a lot of the retailers would have. I think, as you know, and our viewers would know, there are fantastic programs out there that would give you cash back or rewards back. That's generally a fantastic thing to feel like you're getting some cash back in your pocket. That's generally where I tell people there are some things we need to spend money on. It's necessary, of course, that's true. But even for those things, if you participate in those programs, you will get some cash back. So that's a first place. And often these programs are free to join. You don't need to pay in. And you get some handsome cash back at the end of the month. On top of that, there are additional things that you can do. If you are buying things on a regular basis and there are, let's say, dry goods and things that wouldn't go bad, that don't require things like refrigeration, you might want to think about buying them in bulk. And you can go to particular retailers that sell in bulk, or you can combine forces with your best friends or your family or whoever and buy in bulk and share those. Those are generally the tips when it comes to expenditures.
Benay, you've been very helpful tonight. I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming through, Chief Operator.